Now, it is Thursday, and as ever on a Thursday, we get a check of some of the top stories in the United States. And joining me today is Republican strategist and lawyer Amanda Makki, a friend of the show. Amanda, great to see you. Thank you very much indeed for speaking to us.
Great to be with you, Tom.
Thanks. Just before we crossed to you, we were talking to a couple of guests there about the comments made by Pete Hegseth, the U.S. Defense Secretary, who seems to think that U.S. soldiers need to clean up their act, brush up their act. They're getting sloppy and they're overweight. How's this all gone down in America?
Well, definitely you have people on both sides here. So you definitely have people who feel like, maybe people don't have a leg to stand on when they look at who makes up the cabinet, for example. They look at who or what senators look like on the Republican side and say, these guys are overweight. How come weight is now an issue? I think the reality is that somewhere in the middle is a good place. But I happen to agree with Pete Hegseth. And I think a lot of the older members of the military would say, so what would now be considered veterans, would say that, they came in under very different rules than perhaps they have now in the last 15 years for soldiers, airmen, sailors. It's a different set of circumstances that they have to be a part of. So in other words, it was a lot harder back in the day, and the physical endurance and the strength testing and the PT and all of those things were a lot harder than what people have to do now when they enter the military. So in other words, they've relaxed the rules a little bit. Now, if you look back on what happened during the Biden administration, you were seeing men who were soldiers cross-dressing, literally dressing up as women and then posting those on social media. And I think that needs to absolutely stop. And I think that's where Pete Hegseth's going, not just with the weight, but really cleaning up the act of the military so that they act like the military that we've always known and loved here in the United States.
But do you think there's an element of people who are saying, Pete Hegseth got the tone wrong? I mean, he's 45 years old. He's addressing admirals, generals, people with a lot more experience on this planet, not to mention military experience, because he only made it to the rank of major. And there he was addressing these, senior figures. And in some, articles, it's being said that he addressed them like children. I mean, do you think he got the tone of it wrong?
I think that he is the Secretary of Defense, Secretary of War, and so he outranks them. I worked in the Pentagon, and I worked for someone who was the Army General Counsel. So when he was in the Army and he separated from the Army, he was only in 03. He was or in 04, I believe he was a major. But the point is that when he was in the Pentagon as the Army General Counsel, he had 4-star status. And so there was definitely a point where someone would say, well, you only, were in 04 or 03 in the military, and now you have the status of 4 stars, but that's the rank that he has. He outranks them. He has the ability to dictate the rules coming from the president or in conjunction with the president. And so I think a lot of people looked at it as, wow, there's, 50, 60, 70-year-olds, clearly people older than him sitting in that audience with many more years, decades of experience. However, he is the Secretary of War, and he is putting out these mandates, and they have to comply, or else they need to find other jobs or retire.
Okay, so is there a sort of a public perception out there in America that the generals perhaps aren't quite as in shape as they ought to be, and then they need to lose a couple of pounds? Is that a sort of a widely held perception, would you say?
I wouldn't say it's the generals so much as it is how the military's changed over the last decade or so, where they have just relaxed the rules and relaxed the standards. It was a lot more difficult, some would say. I did not serve in the military, but people would say it was a lot more difficult. And then, during the conflicts that we've had in the last 15 years, they have been more engaged in recruitment, and recruitment sometimes means relaxing standards, and they want to come back to traditional standards. Of course, insert that with the Biden years years and the Obama years, where they did allow, as I mentioned before, where you had people that were members of the military posting on social media that they, are cross-dressing or doing different dances. I mean, just things that are out of sort for the military and what most people don't associate with the military.
Okay, so it looks like there's going to be a bit of a revamp of old-fashioned standards and getting the soldiers back in line in the United States.
That, but also I would say the timing of this happens to coincide with a government shutdown here in the United States. So that obviously affects the military. So the focus maybe shifted immediately to when are people in the military going to get paid? So people didn't so much worry about what Pete Hegseth said, other than the sound bites that we saw. People more focused now on what happens with the government and when are we going to reopen.
Right. Well, you've leapt on to the next topic I was going to ask you about, which is, of course, the shutdown. Day 2, 750,000 federal employees have been sent home without pay. President Trump meeting his budget chief, Russell Vought, today. And I just wonder, what is the latest overall on this issue? Does it look like there could be an impasse?
It looks like both sides are digging in their heels. And it's really amazing to me. And of course, I come at it from a perspective of objectivity, if I can be honest, and say, this is a bill that has been passed 16 times with Democratic support. They are literally continuing the government on what we call a CR, a continuing resolution, which just means at the same numbers that we've voted for 16 times already, just most recently in March, we're going to continue the government at those levels. That is going to take us through to 7 weeks from now, right before Thanksgiving. And so, late November. And so that's what the Republicans are asking Democrats to support in order to get through a government shutdown so that federal workers can go back to work. And yet the Democrats are digging in their heels on various provisions. That's really meant for a larger, broader bill. If you're funding the government for 7 weeks, you don't need policy changes. In fact, you don't want policy changes because guess what? This is what happens. You have a government stalemate and a government shutdown. You have these two parties that are not willing to negotiate right now because they are so dug in. And the Republicans are saying, we have a 24-page bill you voted on 16 times. And Schumer said he's not going to hold up the government last March on this very same bill, yet you are stopping the government from working because you want to push other provisions that we should decide in a much larger and broader bill where we make policy changes. So I think that's the big issue right now, is that the Democrats have basically dug in. Republicans feel very confident in their position. 63% of Americans want the Democrats to support the Republicans in continuing the government. I think what's important here to remember is that this always comes down to elections. And we have a governor's race in New Jersey this year, next month. That means early voting has already started. But more importantly, we have a race in Virginia, which is much of Northern Virginia tends to house a lot of the federal workers who are now sitting at home furloughed. So the state of Virginia has about 300,000 federal workers of the 750,000 that you mentioned. Now, not all of them are in the DC area, but 300,000 of them live in Virginia, and they are voting for their next governor right now. They started voting September 19th. So I think we may see an outcome of what actually happened with this shutdown in the form of 2 elections in New Jersey, but more importantly, in Virginia.
Now, we've heard from the president on this issue, and since the beginning of his term in office for the second term, he's made no secret of his desire to cut down on unnecessary expenditure as he sees it, and perhaps lay off people whose jobs aren't entirely necessary, and he believes they're costing the country too much money. And he heard him saying that this shutdown is actually what he called an unprecedented opportunity. And I just wonder what to read into that, because I'm just wondering whether that means perhaps he'd like to see some of these temporary freezes to headcount being made permanent. Is that one interpretation of it?
I think that's accurate. I think what he's looking at are jobs that are no longer relevant, perhaps, and the federal government is very clunky. It's very hard. Civil servants have a lot of protections in their jobs, but perhaps President Trump and Russ Vought are looking at ways to cut these ancillary jobs that they believe are maybe either redundant or are obsolete, no longer relevant, or don't fit within the mission of President Trump and his administration. That's entirely up to him if he wants to do that. Now, we saw that happen a little bit earlier in the year with what Elon Musk was doing with Doge and trying to clean up government waste, fraud, and efficiency. And so certainly there are going to be jobs that can be looked at as being inefficient and no longer necessary. And where that hurts the Democrats is that a lot of these civil servants, I would argue most civil servants, are Democrats. And so you kind of gave President Trump and his team an opening to go in and take those jobs and say, these aren't relevant anymore. So it created a problem not only for the Democrats on that front, but I think also, again, talking about just how the perception has been of this. I think the Democrats are losing when it comes to the perception argument to the general public. How is this being perceived? It's being perceived that Democrats are stopping the Republicans from trying to continue the government at current levels. And then you're giving President Trump an opening for him and his team to be able to cut jobs, which he believes is in the best interest of taxpayers, given these are taxpayer-funded jobs. And so it creates a worse situation, worse dynamics, definitely for the Democrats than for the Republicans.
Okay, now, Amanda, you mentioned a name that we haven't heard for a while. We used to talk about Elon Musk quite a lot a couple of months ago, not quite so much lately, but he's back in the headlines. I mean, it's been a real roller coaster of a year for Elon Musk, some real ups and downs, but there's an up that we can discuss. Elon Musk is the first person ever to surpass the $500 billion US mark in terms of his net wealth. I mean, that's cause for some celebration, I'd imagine. What's behind this?
Well, I mean, he's heavily invested in various aspects of the economy. And obviously, he's someone who has worked hard to get to where he is. And I think a lot of people, certainly during the campaign, he was able to inspire a lot of youth, just the way, Charlie Kirk did. You could say he is inspirational because a lot of the youth look to him as, I want to be like him. And so what he's been able to do, I don't know that it's definitive that he is out on top right now, because I think it's been between him and Larry Ellison, the CEO of Oracle. But nevertheless, he's a very wealthy man, and he's been using his money to influence politics in the last at least year, if not year to 2 years, if not longer. But really what we've seen of him in the last 2 years has been really a dynamic where he shifted all his efforts to help President Trump get elected, especially after President Trump was shot last July in Butler, Pennsylvania. He really said, the gloves are off. I'm coming out and I'm going to support him, even if it means it could be detrimental to the assets that I hold and the companies that I'm a part of. And certainly it did have an impact when he and President Trump parted ways, when he went after President Trump on certain things, certain policies that he didn't like. It did have an adverse impact on him, but obviously, as we're discussing, not that adverse, because he still seems to be leading, if not at number one, he's in the number 2 spot in the world as the wealthiest man in the world.
Yeah, I mean, we heard President Trump talk about Elon Musk a couple of months ago. I think he described him as being 80% genius, 20% problems. I mean, that's not entirely, that doesn't sound like a personal attack. I mean, we've seen the two men together as well, haven't we, at a public event? I mean, is there a sense that the two men have sort of patched things up?
I really hope so. And I think a lot of people, while we were all mourning and grieving what happened with Charlie Kirk at his funeral, I think a lot of people, the takeaway was also, wow, maybe in his death, Charlie Kirk was able to bring these two individuals back together once again and reunite them, because there was so much force for good that they did together. Doge certainly was a great example, I think, of allowing for people who would never be part of the federal government, but for a small stint that they could do. And again, the federal laws are so clunky when it comes to hiring someone for a defined period of time. It's just hard to do. But Elon Musk was able to bring in some of the brightest minds in the world from the private sector, people who weren't doing this for money, glory, or fame, but really doing it because they believed in the mission and the cause. And Elon Musk spearheaded that and was able to root out a lot of things that the government wasn't aware of when it comes to waste, fraud, abuse, efficiency, inefficiency. And so I think President Trump certainly lauded him for that. I think where it came down to was, personalities, which is understandable when you're dealing with people surrounding the president. But I think Elon always had the best interest of our country at heart. And I think a lot of people continue to believe that. So I hope that he stays active and involved. Obviously, he has his own financial interests and, boards that are looking at what he's doing and what he's saying. So hopefully it all works out in the end.
Okay, and just lastly, Amanda, and briefly, if you will, I mean, we've here at Al Arabiya English, a top story for us all week has really been focusing on President Trump's 20-point plan to bring about a conclusion to the war in Gaza and a framework for peace between the Palestinians and the Israelis. I mean, how much of a top story has that been in the United States? Is that what a lot of newspapers, news shows have been leading with?
Well, unfortunately, a lot of this was the culmination of it happened right around the time of a government shutdown. So obviously that is front and center right now in the United States. Everyone's focused on when does our government reopen? Of course, what happens in the Middle East has always been an important point when you have a crucible in the Middle East that people are always worried about what's happening, but it's not front and center in the United States. I think this comes down to, for Netanyahu, does Hamas accept or not accept? And what does he do in those two scenarios? I think it's very difficult to see how this is not going to be a challenge for Netanyahu if Hamas does accept, because he's at a critical time right now in his own reelection. The polling numbers are not good for him. He needs the help of his conservative base, and he has to sell the conservative base on this in his own country. And so I think it's a challenging thing for him, but it's great to see 8 Arab and Muslim nations that are in support of this, and hopefully Hamas will agree to the terms. I think the hardest part for Hamas is going to be that clause 17, where they basically say, no matter what Hamas does, we're still going to go in and do the humanitarian aid, and we're still going to go in and clean up what we have to with Hamas. So Hamas is in a tight spot, but hopefully enough Arab and Muslim countries' influence and Western influence will make all the difference for them to engage, and hopefully we see a new world order there.
All right. Well, thank you very much indeed. Always a pleasure talking to you. Republican strategist and lawyer Amanda Makki, thank you very much indeed for your time.
Thank you, Tom.